Hey there, it's Jordan with Status Coup. Delighted to be joined by Andre Stackhouse. Wanted to have you on. You're with Whole Washington in Washington State, doing a whole lot of great activism on trying to get ballot measures for healthcare, universal healthcare, in addition to other things. So, wanted to have you on. Obviously, Medicare for all at the moment nationally is, you know, I don't even want to get into it because it'll depress me. But I wanted to kind of focus on what the approach is on the state level. I know there's been debate between people who say it's got to be federal, and the focus on or the efforts to try and get it on a state level are for nothing, or actually detrimental to the national Medicare for all movement. But I wanted to kind of hear what whole Washington is doing, obviously trying to get it on the ballot, and what the approach is, not just to get it passed, but then how would it be, how would it be paid for? Because on the state level, obviously we can't print money.
Yeah, I think that what we're trying to do is pursue pursue the most direct paths that we see to implementation, uh, while also being open-minded to the fact that a multi-pronged strategy is likely to be the strongest, and that you don't really know where the most potential lies unless you're actually out there testing it and kind of collecting that experimental data. So we can sit here and pontificate about this is the best strategy, that's the best strategy. But we really go to where we see the most potential based on our experience out there. So as an example, we have always introduced our healthcare policy, single payer healthcare policy, into Washington state legislature. And we have some allies in the legislature who have been great at introducing it into our Senate, but we always see that it gets stalled, right? It gets stalled in committee. It doesn't get a vote. It doesn't get public hearings, right? And so what we are able to do with the ballot initiative strategy is show or sort of have this relationship with our legislators, which is, look, we would love for you to pass it, but if you're not going to, then we will simply take matters into our own hands, take it directly to voters, and put it on the ballot, whether you want it there or not. And so, that kind of can be very motivating to legislators, in fact, because they kind of have the attitude, I think, a little bit speculative, right? But if something like this is going to pass, they would rather be the ones to pass it, because that gives them they're able to then run off of that as an accomplishment. They're able to have more influence over the policy itself. So something that they might prefer to ignore, like healthcare, the moment that they see that it has political legs, right, it then becomes motivating to them to actually be supportive. So we basically think that by building the public support, but not just the support for it, but the political means to pass it, that we will be able to build a movement that's actually going to get this over the finish line and see it all the way through to implementation.
So let's talk about that. Getting it on the ballot obviously is a process, but then if you get it on the ballot, you're going to be up against, insane amounts of money. California saw this as far as special interest, big pharma, et cetera, et cetera. So if you get it on the ballot, what is the, kind of strategy to actually get the message out there, the truth out there, combat the special interest, corporate Neanderthals trying to put propaganda out there? And then in a perfect world, if it passes, what is kind of the funding mechanisms that whole Washington is proposing?
Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting area to get into, because a lot of the times, and in some cases by the exact same critic, they will tell you that, state level pushes, state single payer hurts Medicare for all. And then they'll tell you part of the reason is because if you get it on the ballot, then you're going to be flooded by an opposition campaign from big pharma and private health insurance, right? And the observation that I think ought to be made is, why would these opponents to single payer healthcare expend all of these resources to fight a campaign that was actually going to hurt Medicare for all, right? If they don't want Medicare for all, and we're in a position to hurt Medicare for all, why not? Why would they then fund opposition campaigns to the tune of millions of dollars? So that's the first observation, is that the opponents of single payer healthcare recognize the threat of state level campaigns and especially ballot measures. But yeah, I mean, I think that part of the advantage of a ballot measure, right, is that you can't get it on the ballot without first building a significant public movement, right? So you need people. You need a lot of donors. You need a lot of volunteers. You need a lot of signature gatherers. And then you need to go out and put it in front of the face of, hundreds of thousands of people just to get it on the ballot, right? So you've already front loaded a lot of the work in terms of building public support. Now, when we get on the ballot, it's true that it changes from a signature gathering campaign to a get out the vote campaign. And so then, especially then, we'll need to raise significant money in order to spread word and get it out to people. And actually, that's why I'm so grateful for the invitation on today, because I really think that what we need is for not just this to be like a Washington state movement, but I think we need the healthcare justice movement at large, the Medicare for all movement, the left, as it's sometimes often referred to, the progressive movement, to come through for us, and recognize the opportunity here, recognize the value of the work being done here. The fact is, I think if we get on every progressive show, we can really build that call to action. But Bernie Sanders and the squad and sort of the amount of organizing and support that they have, right? With that kind of support, we could raise millions of dollars in 24 hours.
Right.
I'm not saying that that's going to happen, but I'm just saying that the left has resources. The left has the resources to get this done.
Right. Well, I would also say, and obviously, elephant in the room, Steve Grumbine, who does a show for us on Status Coup, has been one of the leading proponents against the state approach. Talking about funding mechanisms and that it would actually hurt the national movement. I don't know necessarily. I don't know enough, to be honest. I don't like to speak out of turn if I don't know enough about what's going on in the state First National, but I do know a lot about activism. I do know a lot, having interviewed a lot of activists. And I think, instead of, squabbling with each other, regardless of a different approach or different strategy, people need to figure out where we can come together to work together. So to me, listen, I don't really think it's whole Washington trying to get it on the ballot in Washington that is hurting the national Medicare for all movement. I think what's hurting the national Medicare for all movement, in my opinion, is we don't really have people in Washington right now on the elected level that are actually willing to agitate the Democratic Party. That's my opinion. Speaking about the squad, et cetera, they deserve credit if they do something good, but they also deserve criticism because I'm waiting for the ruckus to be brought to the Democratic Party that AOC recommended. But I will say, in terms of the state approach, I also think there's an element that often gets not reported. In California, which it was sabotaged, and that is complete Democratic control. Years ago, I believe it passed the Senate, but then was stopped in the House earlier this year or last year. It didn't even go to a vote. Federal politicians play a part in sabotaging on the state level. Nancy Pelosi, who it wasn't really widely reported, she played a part in sabotaging it in the California level. So what are your thoughts as far as in Washington state? Do you think that even if you get it on the ballot and theoretically, that's direct democracy, people could vote or vote against it. Do you think the federal opponents of it, I mean, Biden has said he would not sign it. Do you think that plays a part in it passing or not passing in Washington state?
Yeah, and when we come to the topic of like CalCare and federal Medicare for all, I mean, one thing that I say with whole Washington, right, is if we get this thing on the ballot, there's no vetoes, there's no parliamentarian, there's no filibuster, there is no stalling it in committee, right? There's just voters and votes. So I think that is one of the reasons why it is less vulnerable to sabotage. I expect that the opposition to this will be, it's not going to be like local Washington healthcare organizations or local Washington opposition. I mean, the opposition is going to be, from very large industries, right, that span the entire country, and they have that sort of relationship to the federal government. But I think that they are limited in terms of what they can do, and I also still think that just because we anticipate that opposition does not mean that we don't proceed. Part of what we have to do is to have this fight and see what we're up against. If we stay in the dark, we're never going to get there. And so it's possible that it looks like everything's coming through, and at the last minute, something stops it, right? And maybe it comes from the federal government. Well, as much as we can, we try to anticipate those things and insulate ourselves from them. But it's not necessarily, this is already not our first attempt. The important thing is to stay out there and to keep getting closer to our goal, and learning as we go, building off of past failures. And so I think that if we do that, and if we bring lots of people in who have experience with this sort of thing, we can overcome those sorts of obstacles.
And let me just throw you a curveball, because I'm curious about this, not necessarily just about universal healthcare on the state level, but just in general. I kind of get frustrated as a journalist because I feel like I'm just constantly covering the same protests over and over. People are chanting, marching the same blocks, chanting the same things. It's not for me to tell them how to protest, but there doesn't seem to be much of an economic action behind boots on the ground. I always say, imagine if George Floyd, those protests, which had millions of people around the country, if even, I don't know, 1/10 of those people were adding their wallets to the protest, whether it's against corporate banking, Amazon, et cetera, et cetera. What are your thoughts in terms of progressive activists? Obviously, there's kind of a deflated feeling right now in a lot of progressive quarters, but we do see this success with the Amazon workers, the Starbucks workers, all these workers that have went on strike. In terms of the activism community, what do you think in terms of actually organizing economic actions to put behind? We're trying this ballot measure. If it's sabotaged, we're going to come together and we're going to economically protest against, name your Washington State corporation, Boeing, Amazon. What do you think about actually putting together or trying to organize economic actions? I'm not saying there's going to be a general strike overnight, but adding a threat with your wallet so that the corporations and the donors realize, yeah, you're not only going to be protesting just traditional protests, there might be economic consequences if they don't do something.
Yeah, in terms of like how direct you make that, I think it is, I wouldn't say that I have great ideas on how to target that. But what I will say is, I think that some of that fatigue you're talking about comes from people feeling like they've put all of this input into the political system and they're not getting the outputs that they want to see, right? And so it's like, I donated a ton of time and money to this political candidate, right, who I thought was going to fight for these things, but when they got into office, nothing happened, right? And so I think that there is something very powerful about investing in the kind of organization and political theory of change that's based more around on what we can do directly as citizens, right? So I think, for instance, if people were to spend time working with Whole Washington, donating to Whole Washington, and then we successfully win single payer healthcare, and everyone in Washington state is suddenly covered for their entire lives with, the best healthcare they've ever had, it will really show people like, like actually things can change for the better. And it happens when we take action ourselves, not when we ask somebody else to take action on our behalf. And so that becomes then sort of an investment in ourselves, right? And I think that, it's really hard to run these ballot initiative campaigns, but I do think that, the citizens of Washington state can become excellent ballot initiative campaign runners, and we can pass major legislation every year that improves our life that our legislature wouldn't consider doing. And so I think that that's something that, and that's part of what's cool about it is I often say that we try to make our campaign a universal campaign for universal healthcare, because everyone can be involved. And even if you can't legally sign one of our petitions or vote for it, you can still collect signatures for it. And so I think that showing people that everyone can be involved and that there's direct benefit in doing so will cause people to say, you know what, that's a better thing to invest in than a politician. And at a certain point, if you get enough investment in it, right, it can even become people's jobs, right? It's like, I volunteer most of my time, right? I'm not paid for it, but like there's a lot of value in citizen activism, right? And I think that we can, if we grow, we can continue to have more people spending their time this way than working for a job they'd rather not do to make money for a corporation that they don't necessarily respect, and then in their spare time volunteering the hour or two that they have available.
Right. Absolutely. Where can people find out more about Whole Washington and your guys' ballot initiatives?
Yeah, so you can go to wholewashington.org. And if you're on social media, it's usually just at Whole Washington. We're on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. And Jordan, if you do have an extra minute for me, I just realized I didn't quite get into the financing, and I don't want to be let completely off the hook.
Sure.
It is one of those things that people often want to know about. So the one of the most common questions is, how are you going to pay for it, right? And I usually like to flip that around and say, how are we not going to pay for it, right? And so we're not going to be paying any premiums, any copays, any deductibles. You're not going to get a bill. The only individual contribution, like for a patient, is a maximum $250 a year on pharmaceuticals. And that's basically the same as Bernie or Pramila's bill. They have a maximum copay of $200 on prescription drugs. Mm-hmm. In terms of so that's like on the patient side of things. On the taxation side of things, we have a corporate tax of 10.5%, and up to 2% of that can come from an employee's payroll. So really most people, if they're paying anything into it, it's probably going to be a 2% payroll tax. But their employer can choose to cover that as an employment benefit, right? So really it's the company has to pay 10.5%, but can do up to a 2% payroll tax. Mm-hmm. And then there is a capital gains tax of 8.5%. There are exemptions on all of these. So with that capital gains tax, home sales are exempt, retirement accounts are exempt, and the first $15,000 are exempt. So really, 90% of Washington makes less than $10,000 a year in capital gains, and so really that's all of the local taxes. A lot of the money comes from federal money, so Medicare, Medicaid money. As we get through our transition plan, will eventually be applied to our state healthcare plan, and then I had one other point about this. Yeah, I just want to emphasize, this is a approximately $5 to $13 billion reduction in total healthcare spending. Our current healthcare system costs us about $80 billion a year. This would bring that down to more like 60 to 65. And just to put this in context, because some people really think that this can't be afforded at state level, there are 16 billionaires in Washington state. Between them, they have about $300 billion. By the way, we've got two of the big ones, Bezos and Gates. So there is absolutely 100% enough money in Washington state to pay for our healthcare. It's just a matter of getting it and saying that we value the healthcare of our citizens more than the ability to hoard wealth in this excess. We are going to make the tax code in Washington actually significantly more progressive when we pass this, in order to not just tax the wealthiest people in Washington state, but then give the people of Washington state a massive cut in their expenses, because healthcare is the #1 cause of bankruptcy, both in the United States and in Washington state. So not only will you be paying a lot less for your healthcare, but the wealthy will be paying a lot more in taxes. So we're talking about really making a more just economic system as well as a more just healthcare system.
Got it. Thanks for explaining that. And people could go where to find out more?
Right, wholewashington.org, and at Whole Washington on social media.
Cool. Thanks, Andre. Appreciate it. Thanks for watching, and make sure to tune in to Status Coup's daily live stream Monday through Thursday at 5 o'clock Eastern Time and Fridays at 4 o'clock Eastern Time.